You're listening to the Surgeons of Horror podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Surgeons of Horror podcast. Its purpose is to dissect horror films, both old and new. And I have the privilege of chatting with a young film director called Ashley Thorpe, who has a film coming out called Borley Rectory. And that will be screening at the A Night of Horror Film Festival here in Sydney on December 3rd, I believe, at 3 p.m. So if I do get this recorded and out there beforehand, go and check it out. But without further ado, welcome, Ashley, and thanks for coming on board and having a chat with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Nice to be invited.
So it's probably fair to say that if you are interested in the paranormal, you would have encountered the many tales that surround the Borley Rectory as a place.
Yeah.
For those that may not have heard of it, how would you describe the place itself?
Yeah, it was a place that became very famous in the 1920s. It was actually a Victorian mansion built in the 1860s on supposedly the site of a former Benedictine monastery. Although there is debate about whether that's true and whether that's just part of the myth. It's all wrapped in so much kind of mystery and hearsay. But it had this kind of myth about it being haunted, and it really became famous in 1929 when a journalist for the Daily Mirror went in, and he himself kind of experienced some sort of strange mysteries and things, and he got Harry Price involved instead of actually putting the worried couple that were living there at the time in contact with the Psychic Research Society, which is what they wanted. He actually went straight to this guy called Harry Price, who was a famed, at that point, debunker of supernatural phenomena. But rather than debunk the haunting, when he came along, he saw things for himself. And then rather than keep it quiet, he did the complete opposite, publicly declared that this place was the most haunted house in England. And then this thing just exploded. This poor ecclesiastical couple wanting to live the quiet life in the country was suddenly they had busloads of tourists at the end of the road, turning up to see this thing from afar. And it just became more and more notorious. The hauntings didn't die down. With each successive family living there, they all experienced different things. And eventually Price himself took over a tenancy of the rectory. And he spent a considerable amount of time with about 60 volunteers investigating the place. And its reputation really ended up being compounded by the fact that during a number of planchette readings in the late 1930s, they received messages from some spirit saying that the rectory was going to burn. And it did. It burnt to the ground. And its reputation never really died. It was in all the national papers in the 20s, and it was something which I discovered back when I was a kid in the Osborne Book of Ghosts, because in the 70s, every single paranormal book, even horror books, would have some sort of reference to this place because it had been so famous. And it was only really in the last 20 years or so that, unless you were moving around in the world of the paranormal, you never really sort of encountered it. Its star had started to fade a little bit, but it's an endlessly fascinating story.
So what was it that first drew you to the Borley Rectory, and what enticed you then to tell its story as a feature?
Yeah, it was the Osborne Book of Ghosts. There was the monsters one, there was the UFOs one, and there was the ghosts. And I still have some of mine. And I like the monsters one because it had Nessie on the front. Yeah. And but the ghosts one had this big double-page spread in there about Borley Rectory, and it absolutely fascinated me when I was about 8, and it scared the crap out of me as well. It was one of those pages that I was quite brave with the UFOs and the monsters, but not quite so brave with the ghosts. There'd be certain pages I'd kind of skip past really quickly to get past those bits. And Borley was one of them. it had it was the fact that it didn't have just one ghost that would just walk up and down a landing. It had half a dozen ghosts, and they were all different. You'd had the traditional Gothic ones like the nun and the monk, but you had strange, amorphous black shapes that would grab people or slap people when they were sleeping. You had cold spots and wall writings and a headless coachman that would thunder down the pathway. There were so many weird and wonderful things. It was like a best-of in one package. You know, it was like, let's have everything all in one place. You know, and a skull, of course. You know, the dug-up skull. It was just the best of haunted houses. And as I got older, I was always baffled, really, why no one had ever really made any kind of study about it. I mean, Borley inspired other famous stories. It inspired The Haunting of Hill House, and there's a lot of Borley Rectory in The Legend of Hell House by Matheson. So it obviously had that story obviously had influence, but no one had just gone in and said, right, this is a film about Borley Rectory. So I thought, well, I must be the idiot to do it. I'll have a go. It's a really complicated story over about 60 years, so it's very dense.
I agree, and that's what I discovered when I like reading about it 4 months or so ago. There's so many layers going on. There's
the layers, and there's so many people that play a part in the story. You know, you've got about 4 families over 3 different eras, really. And it is about 80 years from the point it was built to the point it's demolished. It's more of an HBO series waiting to be made.
Yeah.
You know, that would really do it justice.
There has been some skeptics out there about some of the tales that have come out, though. You know, particularly, we'll get to Harry Price, but he was a bit of a showman. What are your own personal beliefs on the Borley Rectory? What do you think about it?
I'm really not sure. In fact, I was very wary when I was making the film of not being too judgmental upon anybody in it. There's a little part at the end where you do get that epilogue saying, well, they admit to doing this and they admit to doing that. But I don't judge them. I just say, well, they said this. I don't say I agree. I think there probably was something strange about the place. I also think that it just seemed a place that drew a certain amount of just eccentric people into the fold. And when I was doing the reading and the initial research for it, I started to think about things that authors such as Roger Clark and Stephen Volkert discussed about this idea of ghosts representing not just, you know, spooks and spectres as something invading our lives, but as in ghosts being representative of something that's missing from people's lives and what they represent. And I thought Borley was a prime example of that they were very strange people that lived at the rectory, and especially when you get to the time of the Foisters, they were really screwed up people, very strange, duplicitous, odd people. So I just thought it's a perfect example of how people's personalities can be projected upon a place, and they can take from it what they will, really. And in some ways, it's odd, actually. I was discussing this with someone the other day. The ghosts in my film are almost the observers, and it's almost the people. It's almost the families moving in that are the invaders, because it feels like the ghosts are there all the time. And then you get these weirdos that come in and out that they have to kind of watch and wonder who these people are and what they're doing. And it's a bit more like that. The ghosts in my film are quite quiet. They don't actually interact much. They're often seen in the background. They're watching from afar. And I think that ties all back into the Stephen Volk idea of, you know, what do ghosts represent? You know, it's the teller you should be looking at rather than the story. It's all this sort of ideas. So I think there was something interesting there, but as to whether it was beset by ghosts, I wouldn't like to say. And then I'd like to say, with Price involved as well, you know, it's even more slippery.
Yeah. Well, that was going to be my next kind of question, really, about, you know, Harry Price, because obviously part of your story centres on him. for those that aren't aware, he was one of the earliest psychic researchers on record. An intriguing character, I'd like to say too. How did you go about trying to capture his persona on the screen for your film?
It was fun trying to capture his persona. I was quite lucky because I managed to track down a couple of bits of newsreel where he was actually speaking direct to camera. Those old kind of pathé news, movie tone type things. And I think one of the first things that I ditched was his horrible received pronunciation that he used to put on for the cameras. Because it's like, getting in touch with your dead relatives. These horrible movie tone voice he used to put on. Because people would just be falling about laughing every time he spoke.
Yeah.
He did consider himself very much a scientist, very much a self-labelled scientist, and he was adamant that he was going to turn psychical research into a reputable avenue of science. And initially, it looked like he was on course for doing that. But his background in showmanship and conjuring, and also as a salesman, started to scupper that and undo a lot of those things. Because the first thing he obviously did, where he moved away from this old psychic research society thing, which was this stuffy Victorian establishment. He moved away from that and he courted the press because he realised he wanted to get the people on board with it. So he'd stage these big media events to open a cursed box to prove it wasn't cursed, and he'd get the press there and he'd have crowds watching him open this thing, and it was a little bit like a circus. So people started to question his methods, and especially when the books started coming out, and they started, I think, to wonder whether this is all just as a publicity machine. And then I think that people started to regard him with suspicion. But in terms of representing him on screen, I actually portray him very straight. I try to portray him as very much an observational figure. Strangely, like a general in the background, he's strangely absent from a lot of the actual investigations. He's, I try not to judge him too much. He's mysterious enough, I think.
Yeah, and there's one element there where, and we'll come to Reece Shearsmith. There's an element where Reece Shearsmith's character is walls the nun figure out in the garden.
Out in the fog, yeah.
Yeah, and then he kind of back and Bryce is just, still.
He just hasn't moved.
That was a really interesting moment there.
Yeah, the funny thing is, when I was filming that with Jonathan Rigby, who played Price, he was questioning. He said, "So why didn't I run off with him?" And I said that I'm kind of making this point that the journalist is there and he's so hungry to see the ghosts that he will literally chase shapes in the dark. Whereas at Price is watching, he's an observer, he's in the background, and he might not necessarily have seen what Reece's character, the journalist, is seeing, which is why he didn't just bomb off into the dark chasing. And I wanted to have a very key scene to say that people in this film aren't necessarily seeing the same things. There isn't definitely a ghost at the end of the garden. They think they saw something, they chase it or they report it, but the other person, the other observer, might not be seeing that, and that's so often the way with ghost stories and things. What was that? What? It's the classic horror trope in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I actually really liked that scene. That was really cool. So look, the addition of I want to just talk about the addition of Julian Sands, because he's got this, very quintessentially English tones. Seems to really ground the movie because of that. It gives this authentic feel to it. Could you tell me about how the casting of Julian came about at all?
Absolutely. Julian was the very first person to come on board, actually. We made this film in a very arse-about-face way. We recorded the narration pretty much the second I'd finished writing the script, back around Christmas 2011. I just interviewed him for Fangoria magazine because I did a big retrospective on Ken Russell's Gothic and spoke to him at length about that. And that was how I got in contact and chatting with Stephen Volk as well, because Volk obviously wrote it. And Julian, you never really believe that whoever it is that, or I never really believed, maybe, whoever it was I was interested in was generally interested in what I was doing. But Julian genuinely seemed to be interested in what I was doing, who I was, and what I got up to. And he went off and watched my short films online. Without prompting, he just went off and thought, I wonder who this guy Ashley is. And he went off and watched them, and he said, oh, they're really interesting. I really like them. Are you working on anything at the moment? And as it was, I had just finished this script, and I asked if he could read it, because he was aware of the Borley Rectory myth, and was a big fan of classic kind of English Gothic horror stories. And like you say, I thought that his voice was perfect, because you could have gone down the route of the old Carlsberg advert, kind of Borley Rectory, and it would have started to sound a little bit History Channel. Shocker duck, where everything's really over the top, and it brings I think Julian's voice, like you say, brings a very different tone to it. It doesn't have this classic expository documentary feel about it. It's, you do imagine that he's just finished playing cricket, and he's just sat down telling you a story over cucumber sandwiches. It gave it a bit of a different tone.
Yeah, he's also got a way of bringing a bit of a fantastical element to it too, because of the way he's quite kind of melodic, really, the way he talks, and it kind of gives this extra feel to it, I think.
Yeah, I think somebody recently said that they thought that his narration had a lovely blend of soothing quality, but yet also occasionally menace. That it was kind of laid back and quite calm, but not that classic sort of narration that you usually get over documentaries about serial killers and those sorts of things. I didn't want it to have that kind of feeling about it. I wanted to kind of just make it have a different feel in some ways. I mean, one of the documentaries that really influenced this was actually a thing called Wisconsin Death Trip, which was it's well worth seeking out. I mean, there's some pretty naff copies on YouTube, but it's worth having a look. And it's an old BBC Arena thing about this outbreak of lunacy, pretty much, that broke out in Wisconsin in the 1800s. And it's a beautifully shot black and white thing, but the narration in it is all done through contemporary newspaper articles and diary readings and things like that, but they're read by the characters. It's not this, and then on Tuesday the 3rd, it doesn't have that hammered in gravitas thing about it. It's the characters, and sometimes what they say is whispered, like you're in a very private space, and it's very, you almost feel like you have to lean in to listen to it. And I wanted that sort of quality, that it was a bit more intimate and not this, classic documentary approach.
Yeah, and I think you nailed that, to be honest with you. I feel like you're, you do feel like a voyeur. You do feel like you're kind of being pulled in, invited into these little nooks and crannies, the shots through the keyholes and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I wanted it to have this kind of sense of intimacy about it. In some ways, I wish I'd done more of that. I mean, I had all these. You're pushing how much you can get away with the audience as well. I mean, I put in as many shots of corridors where nothing's happening, so I thought I could get away with it. Because I'm going to lose them if I'm not careful. It's but it seemed really important to have these shots of the house where you're just listening to it. You're listening to the billowing of the curtains. You're listening to the creaks. And it also records some of my favourite bits in at the end of Halloween, where you see where things have happened, and now nobody's there, And I really wanted to have that sense of it's this idea of being in the house when there's nobody there, And that goes back to Shirley Jackson again. Whatever walk there, walked alone. It's this idea of a house slowly going insane, left on its own, and having those sort of little intimate close-ups of the house and empty corridors and things seemed to, me trying to visually make sense of the things that Shirley Jackson was talking about at the opening of the story.
We've already mentioned him, but another familiar face, that you have in your cast is Reece Shearsmith, who is known primarily, obviously, for his work on League of Gentlemen and Inside Number 9. I'm really curious about how his involvement came about. I mean, he's no stranger to macabre and being drawn to the macabre scene in a lot of his work, but he's quite a chameleonic kind of actor anyway, so it was kind of interesting having him come on board.
Yeah, he's a curious choice in some ways, but then the more you find out about him, it's almost insanely. It was almost destiny. He basically came on board because he retweeted a poster for the film when I was trying to raise money for it back in about 2013. It was late 2013, and I thanked him. I said, "Well, that's brilliant," because obviously he had about 100,000 more followers than I had. And I said, "That's amazing. You just doing that and just saying this looks great and retweeting it had a massive effect on contributions coming in." And so we kind of followed each other, and he sent me a private message saying it looks great. I've always been interested in Borley. What are you planning on doing? So I told him, and then with that kind of bravado that you get after you've had a couple of beers on a Friday night, just said, "Do you want to be in it?" And he said yes. And it really was that simple. And at first you're just going to go, "Wow, I can't believe it happened." And then after a while, as we got chatting, I suddenly realised that he was even more of a Borley Rectory nut than I was.
Right,
because not only did he have the same Usborne Book of Ghosts when he was a kid,
yes.
he had exactly the same one, but he'd gone so far as to on the double-page spread in the Usborne book, there's a cross-section of the rectory. So like they've taken the roof off and you can see all the corridors and the rooms, and it points out where all the hauntings took place, or the manifestations anyway. As a child, Reece had taken that illustration and built a cardboard replica out of cardboard boxes. I couldn't quite believe that. And he said, "Yeah, I've been mad about Borley since I was very young. I've always been fascinated with it." So he couldn't wait to come on board with it, and was very, very supportive from the outset.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, we should probably stress that the Borley Rectory is a very much an ensemble piece. Although I did notice that in the cast there was also Nicholas Vince.
Yes.
Horror enthusiasts would probably know him as the Chattering Cenobite in Hellraiser. Well, but I must say, it is an ensemble piece.
Very much so. Yeah, very much. I was very lucky to get an amazing team of actors together. Yeah. Jonathan Rigby. Funny enough, that came about after I got Reece involved in it. Because I was so excited when Reece said he was going to do it. I started rewatching all the League of Gentlemen and anything else I could get my hands on that he'd acted in. And there was a documentary about one of their Christmas specials, which was very obviously inspired by the old Amicus portmanteau horror films. And the person that hosted that documentary and discussed Amicus in general was Jonathan Rigby. And I was sat working on the storyboard whilst this documentary was up in the background. And then just suddenly looked up, and there was Jonathan Rigby stood there in Highgate Cemetery, and thought, there he is, there's Harry Price. And just reached out to Reece and said, are you still in contact with Jonathan? He said, yeah, absolutely. Get hold of him here. And again, I just asked him. I said, it's a micro-budget job. I don't know how long it's going to take. Would you like to be part of it? And he said, yes, sounds fascinating.
Yeah, far out. God.
I was very lucky.
Yeah, a lot of things sound like they fell in place. It was meant to be. Look, we've spoken about the subject matter, obviously in great detail, and some of the key players involved. But we actually, as yet, and this is obviously me as the host, have neglected to discuss this with you, but it's what I believe is the key selling point of your movie, and that's the style in which you are telling the tale. Describe the process that you use and the decision behind the animation.
It's kind of a development of the style that I used to create my early short films, which I describe as kind of a variation on rotoscoping. It's I generally take green screened actors and then create completely either painted or digitally painted backgrounds and add them to them, and then I kind of animate in over the top to try and make them a bit more stylized and in this case very kind of film noirish and German expressionist shadows in like really over the top, because I didn't want it to look like a bunch of people in period clothes stood in a room. I wanted it to really evoke those films of the 30s and 40s and just be ridiculously stylized, because it was a strange balance to try and find, because like the Osborne book that told the story very succinctly and visually, I really wanted to hopefully fascinate the people with the images, because the story is so sometimes bewildering, and by modern kind of horror standards and things, it's actually quite slow, maybe a bit kind of ponderous and flat in some ways. When you get a modern audience sat there, it could be quite hard. It could be hard sell. I still refer to it as a bit of a Marmite film. You're either going to get wrapped up in it and get really into it, or you're just going to go, what's this? It's black and white. That character spent 10 seconds looking down a corridor. What are they doing? Why haven't there been any jump scares yet? Ghosts are supposed to be in your face.
I think it's important to add, though, that it is a documentary. It's an animated documentary.
Yeah, very much so, yeah. I tried to dramatise a lot of it as well, yeah. I tried to, because that was the other thing I thought that Wisconsin Death Trip did beautifully, that it isn't just like a History Channel documentary. It does try to gently dramatise some of the events, but not in that horrible way that most things are kind of done in recreations, where they'll just put a flat cap on somebody and do some Adobe plugins or some scratches, and it's like, there you go, it's the 30s. It's like, no, that's rubbish, terrible. So I tried to kind of introduce in a documentary style what was going to happen over the next couple of scenes, but then play it out as if it was a drama, even if it has this kind of arch 1930s staginess about it in places. I wanted it to work as a drama. I wanted to make a documentary about a haunted house that hopefully in places is actually quite spooky and unnerving, which you don't usually get from documentaries.
No, you don't. But that's why I think this stands out. And I totally got the whole noir and German expressionist kind of elements that's kind of creeping through.
They're not subtle.
I really enjoyed that kind of whole the look and feel of the film. I've written here that there were moments where the film feels like the screen has come to life through the animation that you've chosen. It's almost as though it's breathing or pulsing in places.
Wow.
Because there's elements moving around, in the foreground and the background at the same time as we're seeing like the character move through the space. And I just found it really fascinating to watch. So that's why I kind of was quite hooked, and it was quite hypnotic in a way.
Great. No, that's exactly what I was hoping for. That's really good to hear.
Yeah, I was really kind of blown away with it. Really, I thought it was really kind of fascinating, and made me in turn want to. And I have to apologise, haven't looked at your early stuff, but it has made me go, I want to see more of what you do, because it is something I've not really seen before. But you're right. Like, to me, I really want to emphasise that it is a documentary, but it's a documentary that's told in a way you've never seen before, and that to me is fascinating. I just think this made me think there are ways that you can document and tell the story in a really kind of new way, and I think that's what you're exploring.
I think, yeah, absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons why so far the festivals have actually been quite fascinated by it, and they're obviously finding it really hard to label it. It's some of the descriptions of what it is when it goes up on the websites are really funny, because it's like psychodrama, animated documentary. They just don't know what to call it, because it's such a funny mix of it's, where do we put this? What hole does this fit in? And it doesn't seem to fit in any of them. It's a bit of everything. And weirdly, I didn't sit and spend ages thinking I'm going to try and do something really clever or difficult. It just seemed, it was a gut instinct thing. I've really felt, how would I like to see somebody explore this story in such a way that it evokes the fact that it was very much of an era, so it's very gentle kind of scares. It evokes the cinema of the time. It is about quiet horrors, but it has this kind of psychological element where you realise that you are looking at the weird kind of mercurial qualities of the characters as much as you're looking for, ghosts and ghoulies in the background and things. That it's you can't, it's very difficult to simplify the Borley story. That's the thing. It's very difficult to do that. So, a film that was equally kind of multifaceted seemed to be the right thing to do.
I think what you're presenting is a really fascinating piece of documented history there. It just draws you in, and I think that's part of it too, because as I said already, the ambience that you create with it is another way of pulling you in even further, as you uncover more of these kind of stories that unfold. So look, animation has obviously been integral to your style as a filmmaker, but what was it that first drew you to the art form, and where have you found your inspiration from?
I got into animation because originally I was interested in the only two things I was ever really good at school was writing stories and painting. Everything else was a bit of a blag, just about get the grades kind of thing. But I kind of kept my head above water with storytelling and with artwork. I found that animation was a way in which I could do both at the same time. That I could, and I've always been fascinated by filmmaking and cinema. And I went to uni and they just kind of got fused. And it was one of those things on the film course that was only supposed to be a tiny part of it, the animation. But as soon as I got a taste of it, I just went down that route completely. And whilst people at the time were off aping Tarantino and they were very fixed on kind of what was fashionable and seen as indie film at the time, I was really excited by people like Svankmajer and the brothers Key and these sorts of people that were doing these weird, obsessive films with animation and live action, and which ironically made me like one of the darlings of the film course, because it's like, oh look, we've got another weirdo, brilliant. And they loved what I was doing because it was obscure, but it wasn't opposed at all. It was just, I love that. Look at that. That's so crazy. He's animating with dolls' heads. That's beautiful. So I had to spend hours locked in rooms with bits of dolls and crap. And then eventually, those days that was all done with all on 16mm film. So you sat there with your clockwork Rolex and winding it up. But then as the digital thing came in and it became increasingly difficult to work with film, I kind of drifted into finding my own way of doing this sort of almost like collaging with images, but digitally. Because I still look at Borley Rectory and I see it almost as a moving collage, really. But I'm not using compositing to create Phantom Menace style, believability or an effect as being an effect, or hopefully I'm not. I'm seeing it as a collage where I'm trying to make something look like something from Caligari, or make it look like a shot from Big Sleep, or something like that.
Yeah.
So it was. I kind of drifted into it, and I mean now, my profession is animating. I do a lot of very, very straight stuff, very corporate videos and idents and that sort of stuff, and that's very straight and as dry and dull as dishwater. Sorry, clients, but but this was a way to get back in, almost get back in that room with the dolls' heads and strange lighting, and animating seashells moving around. And, it was just this idea of just kind of loving what you're doing for the sake of it. And obviously crowdfunding gives you an enormous freedom to do that, because it probably would have been a bit of a strange... Well, we did the pitching, we did the traditional route for about 2 years and didn't get anywhere at all. After we had the narration, we were sat dead in the water for about a good 2 years, and then just thought we got crowdfunded.
Yeah, wow, that's crazy. I mean, you can see the passion on the screen. I'm keep picturing it in my head. Some of the elements that you put on the screen, like even just like dust particles kind of floating across.
Yeah, there's a funny story about the dust particles, in that I am slightly obsessional when it comes to details with things. I drive myself nuts, and there were so many occasions where I'd be sat up late at night, and my wife would come back from work, and she'd say, "Are you still working on that same shot? I thought you'd finished that one." And I'd be there looking at it going, "Yeah, but when the book's shut, that dust is moving at the wrong speed. It's way too slow. It needs to speed up a bit. I have to do the dust again." And it was, and there were times where there were certain sections where I would just redo it. It's like, I'm not buying it. Or that dust particles are too big in that shot. It was stupid. Yeah. I need to do that bit again and make them smaller. And I need to speed up at that point, and just stupid things. Just absolutely obsessed with just tweaking it. And and it did get to a point at the end, but I was just, you've just got to stop now. You've just got to stop, and you've got to get it to you sound artists now. Just get it done. Yeah, get it done.
Sure. So that obsession has obviously gotten you to the point where the film's now made now, and it's starting to go out into the big. Where are you finding yourself now? Is it a case that you're supporting this to try and just kind of put it out to more of the festivals and things, or have you got other stuff on the agenda that's coming into the pipeline?
Yeah. At the moment, I think the main plan is to get Borley out into as many festivals as possible. We've had actually a couple of bits of interest about distribution, like DVD companies and things, so people are interested, which is really reassuring. But I'm kind of looking, because at the moment it's been almost predominantly horror festivals that picked it up. And it'd be interesting to see, which is a good thing, because I'm not a film snob at all. Horror's my thing. Yeah. But it's interesting because we're starting to get interest slowly coming in from more kind of mainstream festivals and documentary festivals as well. There's some really big documentary festivals. And because of the things which you were saying before, I think it'd be interesting to see what they make of it and say, well, this is a really strange way of telling a story, and see what they make of it. But I've also had some interest come in from a writer quite an established writer, who is interested in me adapting one of his screenplays, which is going to be a slight departure, but not that much. I can't really say too much about it at the moment because it's very kind of early days with the agent and whatnot. But it's kind of a departure, but in some ways, when I've discussed it with them, they kind of realise it's not that much of a departure. It will probably be a bit more sort of live action stuff, but with some of the stylings of what I did with Borley worked in there as well. So that's quite exciting, and that's going to be very much a next year thing. And with the film industry, you never know. I say next year, it could be 5 years, it could be who knows. So I just keep things ticking over, different projects in between. And I've got loads of ideas for more short films anyway, so I've never run out of things to do.
Well, look, I think we're kind of coming to the end of our discussions, but I do wish you every success moving forward with Borley Rectory and everything on the other side of that. If people are listening to this, and if I do get this out in time beforehand, it is screening at Dendy Newtown in Sydney as part of a night of horror film festival on December the 3rd at 3 p.m. Go check it out. I really recommend it. Until then, thanks so much for your time, Ashley. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure. It's been lovely to chat.
Nice one. Thank you so much.
You're listening to the Surgeons of Horror podcast. Music supplied by Peter Nezik. For more discussions or podcasts, head over to surgeonsofhorror.com or head over to our Facebook and Twitter sites for the latest news and updates.